Everyone, you all. Welcome to tonight's event. The title of the event is Beyond Coexistence, Is It Possible? Women of Faith, the Evolution of Women's Roles Within Religious Communities. And this is brought to you by Congregation Shaarey Zedek, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America Living Fire Ministries, the Islamic Center of East Lansing, the Red Cedar Community Association, and the University Lutheran Church. And this is, the handout here says the 7th, outside it says the 9th. We're going to take the average, which is the 8th. And delicious refreshments are provided by Sultan's restaurant in the handout plaza. My name is Mohammad, Khalil, and I'm a professor of religious studies at Michigan State. We're going to get right to it. First of all, it's nice to see you all here. I know we're competing with another event at the exact same time. The Muslim Students Association is holding their annual dinner at Okemos High School at the exact same time, so this is a good turnout given the competition. I'm actually the faculty advisor to the Muslim Students Association, so hopefully they're not too mad at me. Now, we're going to begin with opening remarks by Sister Nancy Brousseau. She is a facilitator of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America Living Fire Ministries. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Sister Nancy Brousseau.
Good evening, my friends. I just want to make a few comments, and I do this at each of our gatherings. This is our either 8th, 9th, 7th event. But I'd like to just say a couple of things about interfaith dialogue. Because when we use the word dialogue, it can have different meanings for different people. And when our committee began working on this event, which happens both in the fall and the spring, it was very clear for us that our focus is on fostering an inner or interior attitude of dialogue. So it's about our presence to one another. And we are just so delighted that you are all here for this event to share in this building of friendship and care and presence for one another. So it truly is a learning event for us, to listen and to take in what we hear and then to share with one another and to see what meaning it has in our lives. One of the things that I like is in a book that is by, it's a Sister Mary Margaret Funk, and she is a Benedictine sister in Indiana. And for many years, she worked in a dialogue group with the Muslim community and primarily with the Catholic Christian community. And as a result of about 10 years of dialogue, a good, solid, interfaith dialogue, listening and learning and becoming friends with one another and bridging a lot of gaps and misunderstandings and caricatures and misrepresentations, they ended up by publishing a book. And it's a wonderful book. It's called Islam Is, an Experience of Dialogue and Devotion. It's a wonderful piece. And I want to just read this one part that she wrote in here. She says, "During these years, I have entered through the doors of the world's sacred scriptures with awe and trembling. I have sought as much as possible to put aside preconceptions and prejudices and opened my heart to receive those scriptures reverently and apprehend what grace makes present for me. As I have said, I have no illusion that I will come to a full understanding or see into that scripture's revelations. Instead, I bow as deeply as I can, and then return to my own Christian scriptures for the revelation of God that resonates with my baptismal initiation and monastic vows." So with that, it's always an invitation to put aside any of our preconceptions, prejudices, and simply open our hearts and the ears of our hearts and enter into the gift receive the gift of interfaith dialogue with awe and trembling. So let us bow deeply to the mystery that unfolds in our midst this evening as we welcome the revelation of God, Allah, in one another. So let us enjoy our evening.
Okay, we're going to switch the order of presenters. We're going to begin with Dr. Margot Valles, Shaarey Zedek, Jewish educator. She's also an assistant professor in IAH courses at Michigan State and is part of the Jewish Studies program. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Margot Valles.
That was a nice introduction. I'll repeat a little bit so you have an idea of who's standing before you. My name is Dr. Margot Valles, and I'm an assistant professor at MSU in the Center for Integrative Studies in the Arts and Humanities, and an affiliate in the Jewish Studies program. But tonight, I'm speaking for myself, and my views don't represent those of the university or the Jewish Studies program. While I'll try to give a fair account of a diversity of perspectives on the topic of the evolving roles of women in Judaism, I'll be speaking about my own experiences and impressions primarily. I'm up here representing the Jewish take on things tonight because, though I'm not a member of the clergy, I'm Jewish and I'm a woman, which gives me a great deal of authority on the subject. But I'm also a Jewish educator, and most importantly, I've been involved in a wide range of streams and movements within Judaism. My father came from an involved Reform family. My mother came from an uninvolved Orthodox family, sort of opposite ends of the religious spectrum. My parents, however, when they got together, were largely secular, and I grew up in a community where there was a synagogue of one kind or another on every corner. I attended summer camp in a religious school on the traditional side of conservative. I belonged to the conservative and Orthodox youth groups in middle school and high school, and went to a pluralist after-school Jewish high school. In this way, I had been exposed to the strains of liberal Judaism, Reform, conservative, and Reconstructionist, as well as several strains of traditional Judaism, modern Orthodoxy and Hasidic Orthodoxy. And I'll explain a little bit about these movements. The liberal strains of Judaism are united in their belief that though divinely inspired, the Bible was written by human hands. Moreover, in the Reform, conservative, and Reconstructionist movements, Jews believe that the laws and rituals must change with the times. Certain man-made injustices must be rectified as we move forward through history. On the other hand, the traditional strains of Judaism are united in their belief that the Bible was written by God and that the decisions of the sages 2,000 years ago or so regarding the interpretation and practice of laws and rituals should be upheld and maintained as closely as possible despite the progress of history. One of the visible differences between these two types of Judaism can be seen in the prescribed roles women occupy. While it's difficult to distinguish the roles and responsibilities of women from men in liberal Judaism, in traditional Judaism, women study separately, pray separately, sing and dance separately, sometimes eat separately, and generally occupy a different sphere from their male counterparts. In college, I delved into this gender-segregated world. I spent nearly every weekend with a Haredi or ultra-Orthodox family. This was an eye-opening experience for me. I'll give you an example. One afternoon after lunch, I was engaged in a dispute with another guest who happened to be male, which is a big no-no to begin with, about whether God eats man. He said yes, and I argued no, and in the end, the rabbi's wife came and sat and listened to his side, listened to my side, and finally said to the young man, "You're all logic," and said to me, "You're all heart." And this conversation can't take place. Though I felt that my arguments were the more logical and his were more emotional. But because I was female, I was all heart and he was logic. This wasn't the only way that women occupy gender-specific roles within this family. turned out that in this family, the women saw themselves as belonging to a second class. One day, their oldest daughter, a teenager, was at a youth group meeting, and someone brought up that his brother was in a feminist studies program. She didn't know what feminism was. When it was explained, she thought it was the most ridiculous thing she'd ever heard. Men were obviously going to be better at studying and working. Why would women even want to be equal? On another occasion, I asked the middle daughter, probably 9 years old at the time, where she'd like to live when she grew up. She was thinking hard about the question and using her imagination when her mom stepped in and said, "You'll live wherever your husband wants you to live," end of story. These girls and women gave me a close-up view of attitudes that are pervasive beyond their family. In the last couple of years, there have been a number of kerfuffles involving signage in Haredi neighborhoods requesting that good Jewish daughters cross to the other side of the street when they see men approaching, and in Haredi neighborhoods in Israel asking women to sit in the back of buses. These are purely anecdotal examples, and there are plenty of women in Haredi circles fighting for an improvement in the treatment of women, just like in other movements. But these experiences ultimately pushed me back towards liberal Judaism, where men and women are treated as equals, and now I belong to and teach at the Reform Synagogue at Town Congregation Shaarey Zedek. Of course, there are things that I miss about traditional Judaism, and one of them happens to be the unique set of rules and privileges that apply to women and are only observed in the traditional strains. When I stayed with this Haredi family, I felt a deep sense of religiosity. Even though I never had to go to religious services, I stayed at home with the women in the family where we would read, sleep, play games, play with the young children, and since the men weren't home, sing and dance. The burdens of the week would disappear, and the Sabbath was truly a time of rest. This is much harder to achieve in the liberal strains of Judaism, where women are just as obligated to attend and participate in services as men are. There are 613 mitzvahs, or mitzvot, or commandments, or obligations, whatever word you want to use for it, extrapolated by the rabbis from the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. Out of these, 365 are negative commandments, the thou shalt nots, or restrictions, which for the most part apply to all Jews equally. The remaining 248 commandments are acts that must be performed at certain times and in certain places. However, in traditional Judaism, men alone are bound by 245 of these commandments. These rules include when to pray, which garments must be worn, and the performance of numerous ritual activities. Women, on the other hand, were assigned 3 positive time-bound commandments. These are first, lighting the Sabbath and holiday candles, second, baking bread for festive meals, and third, when married, attending a ritual bath when appropriate. One thing that unites all forms of Judaism is a focus on practice and ritual rather than belief. While belief is not unimportant, it's your performance of rituals and adherence to the commandments which determines your religiosity. Judaism is an action-oriented rather than belief-oriented religion. The difference between the movements has to do with a disagreement about which rituals and actions need to be observed. Given this focus on action, some might feel that assigning only 3 positive commandments to women is a form of repression. The traditional theological account for this disparity is more complex, however. These theoretical explanations are potentially uplifting and empowering for women. These are the 3 primary explanations which I'll explain in more depth. First, women are perceived to be closer to God, so they don't need all that stuff. Second of all, women's obligations are the most fundamental in traditional Judaism. And third, women don't need to be bound by all the restrictions that men are bound by. In terms of the first explanation, that women are closer to God, during the performance of these 3 mitzvahs, or commandments that are specific to women, women have an opportunity for personalized, one-on-one communication with God. In traditional Judaism, it takes much more for men to reach the same level of closeness. Moreover, women's ability to carry and birth new life is godlike in a way that men can never share, and automatically connects women and God in a powerful way. In terms of the second explanation, that women form the cornerstone of traditional Judaism, the obligations to light holiday and Sabbath candles, to bake bread for festive meals, and to attend attend the ritual bath monthly and after giving birth coincide with the 3 practices that mark traditional Judaism: keeping the Sabbath and holidays, keeping kosher, the rules regarding what you're allowed to eat, and third, following the laws of family purity. The day of rest and other holidays begin when the women of the household light the candles. This is a time of family closeness and spiritual enrichment, and it's marked by the actions of women. With baking bread, the sustenance of the family is paramount, and it's the woman who is the final arbiter of what's good to eat, what's kosher, and what's not. Finally, women's attendance at the ritual bathhouse determines when husbands and wives can be intimate. The wife alone is responsible for making sure that all intimate encounters are approached in an appropriate and ritually pure way. One can also see this as women holding the key to holidays, food, and reproduction, which is important stuff. In terms of the final explanation, having so few responsibilities should be read against the hundreds of rules and restrictions given to men. Women don't need the same kind of structure and set of practices to be in tune with the spiritual world and communal responsibilities, the traditional perspective says. For example, in the progressive strains of Judaism, a growing number of leadership positions are occupied by women. For instance, at Congregation Shaarey Zedek in town, the rabbi is female, the cantor who leads services is female, the director of the religious school is female, and the synagogue administrator is female. In fact, there's only one synagogue-wide leadership position that's currently held by a man. There's an active sisterhood, more women than men read from the Torah, lead services, teach in the religious school. The traditional Jewish explanation for why this is would be that women have a natural affinity for religion and will take up religious responsibilities when given the chance, while men have to be forced into it through ritual and the commandments. There's something beautiful about these theological accounts of womanhood and the differences between men and women, something that could be empowering to women. But at the same time, as we know from American history, while separate but equal might exist in the abstract, in practice, the separate groups are never treated equally. This, alas, is the situation in Haredi circles, where women's lives are being more and more restricted. On the other hand, there's a growing move towards women's empowerment in modern Orthodoxy, which is the liberal end of the traditional strain. And we'll see in the next few years whether the movement is able to strike a balance between theology and practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Valles. And we're going to save questions for the very end. Our next presenter is Reverend Kennetha Bigham-TSai, the Superintendent of the Lansing District of the United Methodist Church. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Bigham-TSai.
I think that I better start with explaining to you what a superintendent is. And I have supervisory and missional responsibility for 61 churches in a particular geographic area, Lansing and surrounding areas. And I supervise clergy, work with churches on their missional effectiveness, and do a number of other things. But the best example would come, or explanation of what a superintendent does, I think, came from my 6-year-old son. Because when I was assigned out of the local church, out of the pastorate, into the superintendency, he didn't quite understand why Mom didn't have a church anymore. So I thought maybe it would help him to understand if I took him to my new office. So I take him in my office, and he walks in the door, and he stops about 3 steps in the door, and he looks around, and he goes, "Oh, this is like the place that you go in school when you get in trouble." So at least my son thinks that I am the principal. At any rate, it's such a gift to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me. I was asked to present on the evolution of women's roles in Christianity. But the topic is so broad. There's so many aspects of the Christian tradition, from Catholicism to Protestantism through the whole historical gamut that I thought, since you don't want to be here all night and all day tomorrow, that I needed to narrow my presentation to what is on my heart today, which is the idea of call. By call, I mean that experience of communication with the divine, an experience of hearing, seeing perhaps, feeling, or sensing God calling you to use your gifts and your graces for a purpose that is greater than yourself. This is not simply a call to do a certain task or exercise expertise in a certain area. No, this is call to use God-given gifts for God's ultimate purposes, to surrender God's yourself to God's plan to restore the creation and to create a beloved community. With this call comes empowerment and presence of the divine in your life, and such a call demands a response. So I am standing here before you because I have experienced as a woman a call to ministry that happened many years ago in my life. That call has developed over time and is finding its fulfillment in this moment in the superintendency, and I'll tell you about that more a little bit later. But I want to begin with a contention, because there's always been this question within the Christian church as to whether or not women can be called to leadership. But I want to begin with the contention that God has always called women. This is attested to in the Christian text, in the New Testament. If you look at the New Testament text and understand them from a slightly different perspective, you can see throughout evidence of women's call. Now, what you're going to hear me express today is a particular a feminist understanding of the biblical text, a feminist understanding of the Christian story. This presumes that there's a reality out there that the Bible has been interpreted, first translated, canonized, and interpreted from a male perspective, and from a perspective that has marginalized women's stories. So let's look at the stories in a different way. And since we are near the high holy day of Easter, let's begin there with examining some of the stories of the resurrection. You may know many of these stories. They tell the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and all of the stories in the synoptic gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, these are gospels that are shaped from some of the same materials. It was women who were the first witnesses to the resurrection. And it was women who God called to proclaim that. In the book of Mark, in chapter 16, it reads like this. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Salome, brought spices so they might go and anoint Jesus' body. These women, the story goes, went to the tomb and found that a heavy stone that had been in front of the tomb had already been rolled away. They went in and they encountered there a messenger from God dressed in white, but they did not find the body. Jesus of Nazareth was not there. The messenger then tells the women that Jesus had been raised from the dead, and then calls them to go and tell the other disciples. The women respond, and they go and tell. The other Gospels, the accounts in Matthew and Luke, tell a similar story with some slightly different twists. In Matthew, after the women see this messenger, Jesus himself appears to them and calls them to go and tell the disciples of his resurrection. In Luke's gospel, we have two divine messengers telling the women, and this time, the messengers don't tell them or call them to go and tell. They take that initiative and go and proclaim themselves. These are experiences, stories of experiences of women encountering a manifestation of God, of hearing a message from God to use their gifts and to surrender their lives to this in this case, to the work of proclamation, to the work of preaching. The women respond to that call, and they go and preach. These women were clearly disciples, followers of Jesus, and they were also apostles. Mary Magdalene, I think, has been understood as an apostle. Indeed, the criteria for an apostle, someone in leadership in the church, was that that person would have been an eyewitness to the resurrection, and I'm taking this from 1 Corinthians 9:4. They would have been an eyewitness to the resurrection and been called and sent by the resurrected Christ to do a certain work. By this definition, all the women who proclaimed the risen Christ were apostles. Now that's just the Gospels that I've been talking about. In the New Testament, in the letters that have been written by Paul, that scholars believe were written by Paul, those letters also attest to women being called into leadership and ministry in the church. In Romans 16:7, Paul writes, "Greet Andronicus and Junia, a woman, my relative, who were in prison with me. They are prominent among the apostles, and they were in Christ before I was." Throughout the Pauline letters, you get similar types of references. There's a mention of Aphia, who with Philemon and Archippus was a leader of a house church in Colossae. Paul mentions Lydia, a woman of wealth, who converted to Christianity and was a leader in the church at Philippi. As well, the writer of Colossians refers to Nympha of Laodicea and the church in her house. Throughout the New Testament, we see pictures of women in leadership in the church, called to positions of leadership and responding to that call. However, oftentimes, the church and society have marginalized women and kept women out of positions of leadership. In fact, some would argue that as the church became more institutionalized, this marginalization and control of women became greater. In fact, some of the texts in the New Testament that seem to limit women's roles was part of that marginalization and institutionalization of the church. In 1 Timothy 2, you see all of those dictates about women not speaking in the church or praying out loud or having authority over men. Now, we've often looked at those texts and thought about what they tell women not to do. But one of the things that they presume is that the writers of the text were trying to control what the women were already doing. Women have always been called. And throughout the tradition and throughout history, from the New Testament evidence to the stories of the mystics and other leaders in the church, women have responded to that call. So that brings me to my story, and to perhaps a little bit of the modern story of the United Methodist Church. The United Methodist Church first ordained women in 1956. In 2006, I had been appointed as the associate pastor down two faith communities down from here, University United Methodist Church. That summer, before I began that appointment as their associate pastor, I got in a van full of clergy women, and we drove together down to Chicago to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the ordination of women. I, a new pastor, gathered there with other women who had been in ministry much longer than I had. I gathered there with other superintendents and indeed with female bishops. Because today, in the United Methodist Church, women are able to respond to their call to ministry and to serve in leadership in every area of the church, every level of the church. So I gathered there and we reflected upon how far women had come and how far we yet when I became a member as a layperson of a United Methodist church who happened to have a woman pastor. It was the first time that I ever seen a woman in that role, and it wasn't like I looked at her and said, oh wow, a female pastor, I can do that. I didn't think that way. But what I saw was a woman of power, a woman who could nurture a congregation, a woman who was a leader in the church, and because I watched her example, I found within myself my own sense of power, my own sense of possibility. Nothing is impossible. During my time in that little church, we were in Daytona Beach, Florida. We were near a historically black college called Bethune-Cookman College. And my pastor got together with some other women, and they held a conference of African American women in ministry. Here were these bold, bodacious, black women taking over the pulpit of the church. There were hundreds of women in that church, preaching and praying and dancing. In one of the services, there were two women, an older woman and a younger woman. They began to do this wonderful liturgical dance together. And as I sat there and watched them dance, I experienced calm. It was a hearing, it was a feeling, it was a seeing, it was an experiencing of the presence of God and of the empowerment of the Spirit, and of a sense that God was calling me to something beyond myself, something that indeed I could not define. And I would tell any of you, and many of you have experienced call in your life, it's hard to explain it. It is hard to define. But it is a type of drawing and pulling that demands a response. And so I responded and continued to respond through seminary education and study and practice, and continued to respond until I found myself in 2006 in my first pastoral appointment in a van with a bunch of other clergy women on the way to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Conversion Queen. In 2006, I was not yet ordained. I did not get ordained until 2009. And when you first serve in a church in the United Methodist system, as I did in 2006, I did not wear a stole because I was not ordained. The stole is a symbol of one's ordination. And I was ordained in 2009, and our bishop and other members of the clergy, district superintendents actually, laid their hands on my head and upon my shoulder in blessing as I knelt down. But it was more than blessing. There was a sense of pressure in pressing down. It was a sense, the feeling that I got was one of groundedness and community. And it was also a sense of the weight of the call. As I was ordained, someone placed, actually not this stole, it was another one, but I wanted to bring this in. Someone placed the stole around my shoulders for the first time. The stole and its weight is designed to represent the yoke of Christ. The obligation, the compelling sense of needing to respond to God's call in your life as it progresses throughout your life. This sense of being connected and attached to a faith community and to a God God in a way that does not ever stop. So this stole, or not this one, a stole was placed over my shoulders, and I began to live out my call. I continue to live out my call. And I want to tell you a little bit about the stole before I sit down, because I'm sure I'm getting close to my time limit. This was a stole that was given to me in my last pastoral appointment. And right before I entered the superintendency by my last congregation. And what they did to design and make this stole is they went and talked to my family and they asked them things about me. And they incorporated things also that they knew about me. And I just want to share a couple of them. These are rocks, and this is running water over a stream. And for them, they said, for me at least, that it represented the living waters of Christ, waters running through a stream. The rainbow, which represents diversity and beloved community and the inclusiveness of all people. And for those of you who are aware of the issues and concerns going on within the Christian church, we have issues around the inclusiveness of all people in the church and the church's ability to receive everyone's gifts and graces, whether they are male or female, black or white, gay or straight. This wall, the cornerstone of the church, represents solidity. There are people here and there are images of music, musical notes, because I love music. And I talk a lot about the ways in which music creates community. There are blue bonnets, because I'm from Texas and it's the state flower. And throughout here, there are images of lilies, which represent resurrection, images of owls, which represent wisdom, and on and on and on. Images of stars, which represents the broadness of the universe and God's presence in the mysterious. So I wanted to share with you, because this to me is a powerful image of my personal call to ministry and the ways in which my call continues to be lived out and continues to develop. The ways in which my call as a woman is unique and is more and more supported within the Christian church, which is a gift. So I will leave it at that, and thank you for letting me share.
Thank you, Reverend Bigham-TSai. Our final speaker is Aldasouqi. Okay, all right. Aldasouqi.
One of them needs to be on, I think.
Oh, okay. She is a member of the Islamic Center of East Lansing. She is also a poet, activist, and blogger. Please join me in welcoming Aldasouqi.
Crying in the distance, and I look for her, following my instincts. I follow the sound of her cry until I feel like I've reached her. But where is she? I look to the right, to the left, behind me and in front of me. I do circles around myself, and finally I look down, and that sweet baby girl is buried underground, alive and breathing. See. My brother just passed away, early morning Tuesday. We all mourn his death, but his wife most of all. His only son, barely an adult, goes through his belongings, claiming this is his now and that. The cattle, the gold, the house, the well, the horse, oh yeah, and his father's wife. She's his too, of course. See. environment that Islam was born into. Ignorance, chaos, and a complete lack of law and order. The only law that existed was that of tribalism, and the only kind of armor was that of lineage. This was a society without protection. Unless you came from a noble lineage, you could be targeted, abused, taken advantage of, and no one would stand up for you. So you can only imagine how the situation would have been for females. Generally speaking, even today, when a society is full of corruption, the toll on females is larger. When the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, began receiving revelations in the 7th century AD, there was a basic focus on the oneness of God, the hereafter, and morality and ethics. The beginning of Islam was difficult upon the Prophet and his followers because of persecution where they lived. But despite this, there was a focus on the protection of women and the elevation of their status almost immediately. Pre-Islam, a female daughter was considered not only a burden, but also a shame, and therefore often buried alive as soon as she was born. One of the companions of the Prophet narrates to us that during the time of ignorance, which is often referred to Arabia pre-Islam, a pregnant woman that was on the verge of giving birth would do so over a hole in the ground. If the newborn was male, she'd keep him, but if she was female, her grave was already dug. Allah says in the Quran, وَإِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ بِأَيِّ ذَنبٍ قُتِلَتْ. And when the girl who was buried alive is asked, for what sin was she killed? One of the earlier chapters revealed begins discussing the Day of Judgment and its immensity and grandeur. And those two verses are among them. The gravity of the sin was coupled with the Day of Judgment. In another verse in the Quran, it says, when news is brought to one of them of the birth of a female child, his face darkens, and he is filled with inward grief. With shame does he hide himself from his people because of the bad news he has had. Shall he retain her on contempt or bury her in the dust? Ah, what an evil they have to decide. This practice was quickly eradicated, and to further inform and reassure mankind that even a female child is a blessing, God revealed the following verse. To Allah belongs the dominion of the heavens and the earth. I'm sorry, I have a little bit of a mix-up in my verse. I don't know if you guys can see it, but it printed for me. But I'll paraphrase. Basically it says, to Allah belongs the dominion of the heavens and the earth, and he bestows male children to whomever he wills, and he bestows female children to whomever he wills. In the Arabic word, the verse uses the word yahid, which means to gift. God tells us that both a female child and a male child are bestowed upon us. They are blessings and gifts. In the same fashion, Islam quickly ended the practice of women being inherited during the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him. It went to the extent of providing a clear process for divorce, for if a female cannot be divorced, she is stuck at the mercy of a man. Islam went even further to establish justice for women until the end of mankind. It made it so that their status was protected in laws eternally preserved by God himself. Mankind was created for the noble purpose of worshiping God. This is directly told to us in the Quran. The status of women was preserved in one way by making their religious obligations equal. That is, both a male and female are individually responsible for their own deeds and doings. Both male and female attain paradise and God's pleasure in the same manner. Both a male and a female are required to pray 5 times a day and fast regularly. Both are rewarded equally for doing so. Both a male and a female are required to give charity and perform the pilgrimage. Both males and females were required to give the testimony of faith to the Prophet, peace be upon him, as they accepted Islam. And this has been the case since the beginning of mankind. When God commanded Adam and his wife, he commanded both of them to live in paradise and eat that which they pleased except for that one tree. And in turn, they were both held equally responsible for their disobedience. And to make sure there was no doubt, the following verse was revealed after one of the female companions complained to the Prophet that the Quran spoke primarily to and about men. This verse came directly in response to her. Indeed, the Muslim men and Muslim women, the believing men and believing women, the obedient men and obedient women, the truthful men and truthful women, the the zakat, or the obligatory charity on her income and property. Another very valuable and important point in equality is needing education. Especially in times of economic hardships, females tend to suffer when it comes to their education. Islam places the education of women and girls on the same level as the education of men and boys, and seeking education is a responsibility upon every Muslim, male or female. Despite all of these equalities in rights and responsibilities, there are differences between males and females. These are God-given differences like physical strength, menstruation, and childbearing. And as history has shown us, mankind is not able to protect females in these differences. Generally speaking, they are seen as weaknesses and places for exploitation. In times of war, females are often taken advantage of via humiliation, rape, and murder. For this reason, there was a special ruling placed upon Muslims to leave females that are outside of combat alone in times of war. Also, females bear the responsibility of rearing, birthing, breastfeeding, and a mother is naturally a child's primary nurturer. To help protect females during these times and remove the difficulties of rearing children, as well as reinforce the importance of a unified community, Islam has placed financial responsibilities upon males. And not only husbands, but males as a whole. A female need not worry about providing for herself or her children, even if her children lose their father. There are also religious licenses in place to make life easier for females. For example, praying in the mosque is a requirement for males, but not females, and a female's prayer can be equal to a male's, even if she prays at home. A pregnant female is not required to fast in Ramadan, which is the Muslim month where we fast from sunup to sundown for 30 days straight, and she can make up the fast later. The same thing goes for a breastfeeding mother. But to truly understand the status, one just needs to look at the examples from that time. It's easy to talk in theory, but unless this can be seen, it's nothing other than theory. There are countless examples that are well documented from the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and the way he treated women and their place and role in that society is exemplary. Women were among the first converts, the first martyrs, the greatest scholars, and even soldiers on the field. They took oaths alongside men to protect and uphold Islam and follow through with it. They played an active role in the mosque and Islamic center life. They were mothers, wives, daughters, but also so much more. They were businesswomen, politicians, educators. The Prophet himself would consult and discuss major issues of leadership with his wives. He loved his daughter dearly. My favorite example is how the Prophet, peace be upon him, honored the first martyr in Islam, Sumayya bint Qayyad, who was female, even after her death. She was survived by one of her sons, Ammar, and the Prophet would refer to him as Ya ibn Sumayya, which means O son of Sumayya. In that time, it was common to be referred to as O son of your father, using your father's name, but the Prophet honored Sumayya by nicknaming her son after her. So even in the tiniest details of his life, the rights and honor of females was a player. Female companions had no fear in approaching him, complaining to him, and even questioning his commands. And in one of his final speeches, he reminded the Muslims of the status of women and the importance of upholding the status and protecting and honoring it. This was upheld and continued throughout a significant period of Muslim history, and during the time of Umar ibn Khattab as the caliph, he was directly confronted by a female in the mosque, and his response was, Umar has made a mistake, or Umar is wrong, and a female or a woman is correct. There was no shame or dishonor in honoring women. Female scholars especially were very prevalent, and many of the bigger scholars that Muslims remember today sought some of their knowledge from female scholars of their time. But in the same way, the presence of Muslims and their role in the development of modern-day math and science is ignored or belittled, these female scholars have been swept under the rug. But as the decline began, the changing status did too. I know it seems like I'm painting a utopia when the reality we see in Muslim communities, especially overseas, is one of extreme prejudice against women and injustice to them. And to deny this is quite honestly blasphemy. And it's not an easy topic to handle. It's difficult to understand why Muslim societies have moved so far away from the ideals of Islam. But it is important to recognize that this deviance is not limited to the status of women in these societies. There is political corruption, economic bankruptcy, social injustice, a lack of intellectual and scientific presence, and ironically enough, even religious persecution, even of women. The problems of Muslims in general is not because of too much attachment to Islam, but actually due to a lack thereof. This is not to say that the issues and problems in these Muslim communities should be ignored or minimized. These are serious human rights injustices and they need to be addressed. My point is merely to distance the true teachings of Islam from the shortcomings of these societies. I also don't personally understand a lot of the contradictory practices, and in turn cannot explain them, as most everyday Muslims cannot, because of not being able to understand the background and the depth of the problems. A scholar at a religious seminar I recently attended brought up a valid point. He said at times he's asked, "You're saying Islam says this, Islam says that, then why does Iran or Iran, do this or that?" And his response, "I don't ever have to explain why Iran does anything. I don't understand it myself." But let's bring the conversation back to here and now. Let's see how our American communities attempt to implement the teachings of the Prophet, peace be upon him, in regards to females. I think our community is a bit unique in terms of Muslim communities since it mimics the diversity of the East Lansing community as a whole. And in the same way, this brings out the best of the broader community. It has also helped elevate and allow our community to break free of the cultural norms that bog down other communities. So let's go back to the ideals. The presence of females in the religious and social spheres is undeniable during the time of the Prophet. And we just expanded our women's prayer area to better accommodate our females. We hold countless events that are joint for both male and female, but we also hold our own events that cater specifically to a female audience. Females serve as board members and committee members, and their input is sought and desired in many different spheres. For those of you familiar with our community, you know that our imam is new, and prior to that, we had to depend on community members for knowledge and education. One of the primary educators was Sister Nokta, a veteran community member. Our Sunday school and Quran school has equal, if not more, female students and teachers. This is not to say we represent the perfect society the Prophet, peace be upon him, based on God's teachings, was laying down the foundations for mankind. For we are also a result of the environment we live in, but we are making strides in the right direction. We also suffer from issues that harm the greater American community, like domestic abuse, but we are working on providing a safe environment for these women where they are able to escape the abuse and at the same time not suffer the vulnerability of the shelter system that, due to limited resources, is not comfortable for a Muslim female. Another place of frustration is the involvement of females themselves in the community. Sure, we have a number of active ones, but the overall presence is still lacking. And this likely stems from a misunderstanding of the importance of their presence both in the home and outside of it, in the Muslim community and in the broader community. But to make it even more personal, as a Muslim female in America, I feel that Islam has allowed me to grow, to be confident, strong, active, and involved, to seek an education, both secular and religious, and so much more, without having to be concerned about the response and views of any individuals or the community, for the only judgment worth worrying about is that of God. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. Thank you to all of you for 3 very interesting presentations. And now we're going to open the floor for Q&A. And before we proceed, what time is the webinar?
It's at 8:10. So
8:10?
if we go on until then, we'll break. Otherwise, we can just continue.
Okay. All right, sounds good. Okay, well, why don't we go ahead and open the floor for questions?
I'm wondering, if you wanted to talk a little bit about the dress.
I thought of including it in the talk, but I just felt like that would throw things off a little bit. And I figured someone would ask anyway. The hijab is not the easiest thing to explain, and it takes, sometimes a little bit of time, but I'll do my best. And the only reason I agreed to be on this panel is because Dr. Khalil is the moderator, so if I fall short, you can help me. Hijab is the physical covering, and it's the word hijab itself means a barrier. So it refers to a physical barrier and then also a mental or emotional barrier. And it's commanded in apply this in different ways. So the basic, the basic guidelines are there, but it's also a very personal decision, and it's also very personal in terms of how it's implemented. It's something that Muslim females choose to do because they believe it is obeying the commandments of God. And there are benefits to doing so, both for the female herself and for the society as a whole. We're told to dress this way so that we may be known as Muslim women. And I feel like in the U.S. especially that I favor that. I benefit greatly from being recognized as a woman of faith. But I guess, what exactly did you want me to cover? Did you have a specific question? Or does anybody else have a specific question? Or do you want to add anything?
I thought your answer was great. Okay, other questions?
You have to toggle between the two.
Oh, okay.
Make sure it's on.
To expand on the same question, I see some of the nuns dress the same thing, and some of the Jewish ladies dress the same thing. Where did that come from?
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. In traditional Judaism, it's a very similar dress code. Married women have to cover their hair and wear long, non-revealing clothing. That's also on top of the rules that Dua mentioned. They have to be distinct from male clothes. So Orthodox women, will wear skirts rather than pants to mark themselves as dressing as females. And some of it is interpreted as commandments from the Torah that men and women should dress alike, for instance. But some of it is simply a matter of custom. For instance, a lot of Orthodox women will cover their hair with wigs. Which seems counterintuitive, but that has become such standard practice that to do otherwise is to call attention to yourself, which defeats the purpose of modesty in the first place, so that there's always a struggle between whether you want to sort of, how you want to interpret that part of the rule.
Oh, yes, you were. Is there a Catholic? Where's Sister Nancy?
Oh, no.
Because I can't speak to, I can't really, I think, do justice to that question.
Of dress in our Christian tradition. Well, I could say a little bit about Catholic sisters, because there is a great similarity. And I suppose, where did that come from?
The picture of Mary, she's covered.
Oh, thank you! I love it! That's great, thank you very much. Yes, that very well could be, because the women wearing, we call it a habit, wearing a habit, and Mary, the Blessed Virgin Mary, is always portrayed in artwork, covered, head, veil, and long.
That's funny.
And being Catholic, we pick up so much. We move right from Judaism. Christianity follows so much of that. And I bet you that that's some of it that's prescribed of the modesty of women. And yet, as time goes on, even the men in religious orders wear habits. So, explain that one. I don't know, but it was.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
It was revolutionary in 1960s after the big council in Rome, where decisions were made that sisters, religious women, we call consecrated women, didn't have to wear their habits all the time. And that really caused some, well, problems for many people because they didn't recognize us. They thought we had to always wear a habit. So we had to rethink that most of the dress that we wore, the veil and the long dress and that, was part of the historical time when these communities were founded. So as a Dominican sister, Dominic founded the order in the 1200s. And the way they dressed was just the way women dressed in the 1200s in Italy. So we were wearing the same kind of outfit that you would see in pictures of women in the 12th century. And I'll tell you, they all said, well, you should keep your habits on. And I said, okay, you try wearing 6 yards of fabric of this big heavy wool, and and I'm not a seamstress, so. But it was considered revolutionary, but we figured, it's an interior attitude of modesty and, what that means for us, so I better be quiet.
Thank you. Next question.
Actually, can I just respond? I want to respond that there is in the book in the New Testament references to women covering their heads, and I don't know whether that's the origin of it in the Catholic tradition, but in the Protestant tradition, in some very traditional churches, you will sometimes, actually in some African American very traditional churches, you will sometimes see women in worship with a small white covering over their heads. And I want to say something also, because I come from a tradition in which in some of the more traditional liturgical Christian churches, and what I mean by liturgical is they tend to follow a more historical liturgy, an order of worship. Some of those churches, you'll find some of the pastors in robes, okay? And those robes set clergy apart and identify them as clergy. I have to say, as a female clergy person, I have always preferred to wear a robe in worship. And that is perhaps because of some of the perceptions of women. When I wear a robe, I become more, in some ways, anonymous in terms of gender. When I have been in situations when I have not worn a robe, I have had people feel free to make comments about my attire or about my appearance that were not appropriate, I felt, in that setting. So in some sense, when I am officiating worship, and these days, because everybody wants to do everything modern, and everybody wants the clergy now to wear blue jeans and a t-shirt. In worship, I am still one who, in particular because I'm a woman, prefer to wear clerical garb, clearly clerical garb, that sets me apart as a clergy person and prevents me being seen in ways that I think are not appropriate as a clergy person. So I can say that.
Don't leave. We're going to take a little break. But first, two things. I want to make an announcement. There's a film called Enemy of the Right, the Noor Inayat Khan story, a film about an Indian Muslim woman who defied the Nazis in World War II Paris in the context of the Holocaust. And so you don't want to miss this. This is going to be at Celebration Cinema in Lansing, Friday, April 25th at 6 o'clock for free, but you have to register online. And there's a limited number of seats. So again, I'll leave this up here. us pray. But we're going to be right back to give us 5 minutes. And we'll continue. Just to as a teaser, when we come back, I'm going to ask about the gender of God. Okay.
Well, I wanted to say, looking at Scripture from this perspective, but looking from understanding faith from the perspective of Scripture, tradition, experience, and reason. And I think that if you understand from Scripture, I think people who understand purely from Scripture might argue that God is male or some sort of male manifestation. But if we look at some parts of the tradition, certainly if we look at experience and include women's experience and reason, we might come to, and I think at least I personally come to, the idea that God is without gender, and that I sometimes intentionally use, and the Bible uses female imagery about God throughout. The Bible is not, you have God imaged as a mother hen, all kinds of female imagery throughout that we have not typically claimed in the Christian tradition, unfortunately. I prefer a broader view and a mysterious view, and actually, to tell you the truth, to assign God a gender and decide, for instance, that God is always male, I think is a breaking of my reading of the commandments of thou shalt not make a graven image, because I consider it an intellectual graven image of God. And I think about, like in the Hebrew Bible, when, for instance, the tradition that you cannot pronounce the name of God, and that those passages in the Hebrew Bible where it would say that you could not say God's name, the way I've always understood those passages was to allow the mystery of God, to allow the limitlessness of God beyond my human intellectual understanding, and that when I try to put God in a box that says that God is only male, that I am assigning an understanding of God and trying to limit or bound who God is. So God is more than I can imagine or articulate. God is more than male or female. And there's a wonderful children's book by a Jewish rabbi, Sandy Sasso. If you've ever, it's called In God's Name. And it goes through all of the different names and images of God with these beautiful, beautiful illustrations. It's one of the best that I've seen that deals with this kind of question of who God is. But for me, God is both male and female and neither male nor female. And I use both pronouns in my prayers. And I'll tell you one quick story to stop. I say the ironic, what is called the ironic blessing over my children every night before they go to sleep. It comes from Aaron, and you've heard it. May the Lord bless you and keep you and make his face to shine upon you and give you peace. May God be gracious to you, etc., right? And so the way I say it is, I say it both ways, but oftentimes I'll say, and make her face to shine upon you. I say that over my children because I want them to hear both pronouns. Now, I get in a little trouble with this because I've gotten in the habit of it. So there was once a time when I was leading a confirmation class, and there I am with all the parents, and I begin to say the blessing on these children in front of their parents, and of course they're kind of traditional, and I go, may the Lord bless you and keep you and make her face shine upon you. And they all just looked at me. So they were rather surprised, but anyway, those are
So not only is God portrayed as there are images that are masculine, there are images that are feminine, but the names of God that are used, like you're talking about, also include grammatically plural. Like one of the main is also somehow supposed to be understood in a plural sense as well. So, just another. Oh, and in the at Shaarey Zedek, the rabbi has made a effort to change all of the references to God to gender-neutral words so that everything is God, ruler, sovereign, instead of Lord, He, whatever.
So I probably won't stray too far from what they said, but in the Quran, which we believe is the word of God directly, God does refer to himself in the he form. So he will, it will say he or his. And there's a few things to consider with that. The Arabic language does not have a gender-neutral word. There's no it. There's no gender-neutral form. The verbs are masculine or feminine. Everything is masculine or feminine. And when speaking to both genders, the masculine form is what's used. So that's just one thing to think about. But God also gives us a lot of his names and attributes, both in the Quran and through the tradition of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And he also, and of these are feminine attributes and masculine attributes. So I don't think that we know the gender of God, nor do we know if he is gendered. And no, the gender could be one of his creation, and he's not a part of it at all.
Those are 3 brilliant answers. Thank you.
On the non-gender issue, it seems to me 30 years ago in seminary, I remember taking a class in Genesis, that it's really not true that Adam or Adam is male. I remember hearing from a Jewish rabbi that it's Adamah, and it's earth creature, and only when, as it was explained to me, only when that earth creature needed a partner was there a differentiation between a male and female.
I mean, that's a good explanation. I like it.
Well, and then Eve being life, so where the gender distinction is so important, earth creature and life, and we've made them now so culturally now that it's all about gender.
Go ahead. Sorry, you keep making me think of things. It's also part of the punishment for eating the forbidden fruit that sort of gender roles are assigned, and before that they're not assigned. So, as punishment, women are going to forever have pain during childbirth, and men will forever have to toil in the fields, and that's only assigned after the fall or whatever.
You have a question over here?
Yeah. My question is for Dua. Thank you for allowing us to watch the prayer, first of all. Secondly, it's kind of a two-part question. You pray 5 times a day. Is each prayer the same? And secondly, if there is not a male present to offer the prayer, what happens at that point?
So to answer the first part, are they the same? Yes and no. Each prayer consists, there's something called a raka, which is almost like a cycle. You have, if you observe the prayer now, you have the standing up, the bowing down, and then the going down, and then where we put our forehead on the ground. That's considered one cycle. So, and prayers consist of these cycles. So the first prayer, which we pray early morning, before dawn, or before sunrise, is only 2 cycles. And then you have the second prayer is 4 cycles, the third prayer is 4 cycles, the fourth prayer is 3 cycles, and the fifth prayer is 4 cycles. There's also slight differences in the reciting of the Quran in some of the prayers you will recite out loud, and the others you recite to yourself. To answer your second question, you can pray by yourself. So it can't be just one person praying by themselves. And if it is a group of just women, the majority of opinions, I believe it's a majority, is that a woman can lead a woman congregation in prayer.
Getting a good workout here tonight.
I was wondering if maybe you could comment a little bit about the role of women in the family or within the family or the home in each of your traditions.
I don't know if it is super clearly defined from an Islamic perspective. There is some things that come just with the natural differences in terms of just women bearing children and pregnancy, and that breastfeeding is until now, only a female possibility. Besides that, I do know that the financial obligation is on the male, and other than that, I don't know if anything is super concrete in terms of other responsibilities. So I don't know if Dr. Khalil can add to that.
Yeah, I didn't think about okay. I'll add something to that. You're right. The Quran doesn't really ever explicitly get into the specific duties of the husband and wife in the family. And she mentioned the male financial obligation, that responsibility. And of course, women also, they actually, in traditional Islamic law, any money that they made was theirs to keep. The husband couldn't touch it. But in any case, you'll hear some Muslims say that women have to cook and clean and all that. But actually, there's an interesting story from the second caliph, Omar, who was a companion of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And the story is that one day, a man goes to Omar, and he hears Omar's wife arguing with him. And so the man walks away, he leaves, and Omar catches up to him and says, what happened? And I'm paraphrasing now. And the man says, well, my wife has been talking back to me, and I want to talk to you about this, but I see you have the same problem. And so Omar says, look, my wife, she cooks, she cleans, and she doesn't have to do any of that. So shouldn't I be patient when she vents? So that's that. Then you also have another hadith or a report about the Prophet, which says that when he was at home, he would cook, he would sew, he would do all kinds of things, and his wife Aisha says whenever he was at home, he always served his family. So the things that we see, for example, in my parents' country, Egypt, it's maybe not seen as masculine for a man to cook, maybe. But actually that's what we see in our collections, in our teachings of the Prophet. So, okay. What happened? The communities. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It took me a second. Okay.
Well, in the Christian tradition, it runs the gamut. And I think that it is not so much traditional in terms of religiously bound as it is culture. So it would be hard for me to answer that question.
In traditional Judaism, the husband's realm is the realm of the community, and studying and praying with the other male members of the community, whereas the woman's domain, the wife's domain, is the home, and she's in charge of that. And that can include today, especially, women are the primary income makers, I forget what the word is, the primary people who make an income in Haredi homes, because the men are busy studying all day. So the women are in charge of raising the family and also raising the money to raise the family. So that's of course not true in the liberal strains of Judaism or even modern Orthodox more traditional strains. That's the case.
Thank you. Sorry for cutting you off.
I'm wondering, for a number of reasons with the conversations tonight, if there's anything within Judaism or Islam that is comparable to the orders of nuns in the Catholic Church. Any instances where women live together, worship together, and so on, apart from men, as they do in the Catholic Church?
Not in the same way, because there's an obligation to be fruitful and multiply in Judaism, which is difficult if you're not married traditionally. So women don't live in communes away from men, but they do pray separately, and it's traditional for the women to pray in the women's shul, the women's synagogue, which can either be a section of a synagogue or it can also be its own freestanding building where there would be female leaders who would lead prayers and would be more learned than the other women and would help interpret whatever the Torah reading was for that week and those kinds of things. But there's also nothing like monks, because really procreating is very important in Judaism. So
I think it's a little bit similar in terms of Islam. You don't have the idea of monks, you don't have the idea of nuns. One of the ideas is that we were created on this earth, put on this earth, and we also need to worship God, but also be a part of the community and earth that we live in. So I don't think something like that exists. But like I said, we do hold religious circles that are just for females. We have they can get together. One of the sisters will hold a prayer session, and I differentiate prayer from the prayer that we just did to a supplication, praying to God without the physical part of it. Once or twice a year, there's just the women. They come out and they will make these prayers for different reasons. So I don't think something like that exists.
This question is for each of the panelists, and that is, what is the greatest form of respect in your tradition that a male can pay toward a female? The greatest form of respect that can be bestowed upon a female. Finally.
I'm not sure. To be honest, I talked a little bit about how women are respected and honored within Islam, and I don't know what would be the greatest, or the one thing that is most important.
Equally stumped. Other than say that's probably individual, and what I tend to think of are the ways in which the opposite happens, actually. So let me think of it from my role as a clergy person. That's the best way I can think of it. So as a female clergy person, probably the greatest form of respect is in treating me from the perspective of a clergy person and not necessarily a woman, okay? In other words, treating me in a way that allows me to own my role as clergy. Because what happens with in the Christian church sometimes with women clergy is is that male clergy are treated like clergy, female clergy are treated like women. Okay, so that's as close I can.
I don't have a better answer, but it reminds me of the wife of Bath's tale in the Canterbury Tales, where of Chaucer, you know, where there's this rapist who goes before King Arthur's wife, the queen, and she says, you know, I'll let you live if you find out what women want, what women really want, and you have to go find out. And he goes and he asks all these people what they want, and every woman has a different answer, and finally he ends up with this woman who is very old and unattractive, and he decides to submit to her, and she says, you can either have me as old and faithful, unattractive and faithful, or you can have me as young and beautiful but unfaithful. And the reason why he ends up being the hero of the story is he says his answer to that choice is, you choose. And she decides that she'll do both for him and be both beautiful and faithful. Anyway, that has nothing to do with Judaism, but I thought it
I have an answer to this question. From Islamic point of view, I can see that, as I understood the question, it is the most respectful example from man to woman. This is the question. So I can say that I have two examples from Islam. Like first, the man to his mother, the wife of the Pharaoh, who insisted that they keep him alive and take him as a son. And of course, the presence of woman is something very natural in life of everyone. But when the Quran insists to start with these stories and mention and focus on these parts of the story, this have a meaning of what woman means to man in his life. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question here?
It's not really a question. I just wanted to add to that wonderful question that our friend over there asked about what the greatest honor is that men can bestow upon women. I think I want to point out two things. One is just pretty much the golden rule, which is treat others the way you want to be treated, right? So if you want to be treated with respect and love, then treat the women, not just women, but men as well, you know, with love and respect. And I think one of the ways you can do that, and especially in Islam, because we see that, you know, all rights are part of a coin. You know, and the flip side of that is responsibilities. So I think as Muslims, you know, one of the things that Islam teaches is that for every right that a man might have from his spouse, he has a responsibility to. Just the way a woman, like any right, any responsibility she has to her family or her husband, she has rights on that too. And I think for a society, you know, partnerships, whether it's business partnerships or in marriage, the way they work best is that, you know, you perform both sides. You know, you must, like, if you expect the other person to perform responsibilities to you, then you need to give them their rights too. So I think that's one of the greatest honors we can give. And ultimately, you know, just to realize that if God, our Creator, you know, sees men and women equal in spirituality and a lot of other ways in His eyes, then who are we not to see each other equal in that sense too? And I think treating women and men, each other, you know, women should treat men like that too. So that's just what I wanted to add.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes. Next question. Okay, we have 30 minutes. How's that? This question here. Okay. We only have 5 minutes. Okay.
So my question is directed towards Dua and I suppose Dr. Khalil as well. Earlier when you spoke, you mentioned Iran, and you said something along the lines of that they're distant from true Islam and the true teachings of the Quran, rather than putting too much emphasis on it, which is a misconception. And I feel like a lot of Americans feel that Iran is like a typical Islamic country, but I feel like the reality is, as you said, it's not. So what specific examples with Iran make it a bad example of a typical Islamic country? Like what misconceptions are there that are particular to Iran?
Okay, I'm not that familiar with Iran and their politics or their religious beliefs and practices, so I will defer.
Thank you, Dua. No, in all seriousness, I guess it would be the particular interpretation of certain rulings, and I guess I'd have to pull out the legal all the laws of Iran and go through them case by case. Or of course, I myself I'm sort of trained in a Sunni tradition, and in Iran it's predominantly Shiite. So that would be something. I mean, I'm not familiar with Shiite jurisprudence, so it'd be difficult for me to really comment on that. Well, let's take Egypt. This is a country I'm familiar with because my parents are Egyptian. So how is it not Islamic, or how is it not? I mean, I guess you could point to specific laws, and you could say, well, this doesn't match my understanding of Islam. You could look at maybe the way that maybe freedom of speech is limited in Egypt in certain ways, and I could say, well, that doesn't match my understanding of Islam, for example. I guess maybe just to avoid politics, we'll leave it at that. Yeah. Other question? Anyone like that? Anything? Or, we have a question here. Okay.
My question would be, how does Islam relate to an issue like the separation of church and state? In other words, the church being in charge of political affairs in the country.
Okay, we're going really off topic now. I will defer.
Well, I'll say this. Historically, there was a kind of separation of mosque and state in this sense. You would have a caliph, you would have some kind of ruler, and you have the scholars of law determining the law. So you would have courts of law for each school of thought, and you have a Christian court, a Jewish court. So you have this, it was almost a separate domain from the domain of the caliph, or the ruler, or the governor, or the sultan. And so there was a form of separation. Now in a modern context, everything changes, because in a modern context, there's only one law of the land in the modern nation state. And so now there's an issue now. You only have one law, one interpretation of the law, so what are you going to do with that? And different Muslim countries have responded in different ways. And I will end with that ambiguous response. I'll leave it at that. Yes, absolutely. I think maybe we have time for one more question, maybe two, we'll see.
I don't have any one particular panel member, but I really enjoyed watching prayer. It was really beautiful, and it's not something that I've ever experienced before. How can we as women share our experiences among one another so that we can understand and appreciate what everybody has to bring to the table?
It's cool that you bring this up, because when these interfaith events first started happening, we had a lot of, usually there's a lot more intermingling time afterwards, but I think we'll probably run out of time today. But I got to talking to some of the women from some of the other churches, and they suggested a first started up, but if that's something that, we're really interested in, I really think that face-to-face, person-to-person is probably the best way to do so.
And I would agree with that. I've been involved in some interfaith community services here over the years, and those have been helpful. This event has been helpful. But I'm also particularly interested in more intimate events, like sharing and prayer practices. Those tend to be, and even this one tends to be a more public event. But I think that happens in individual relationships. And one of my I've had more connection with the Jewish tradition than I have with the tradition of Islam in terms of actual practice together. And it's been very rich, and I'd like to expand it.
I think those are both really good answers that probably cover, what I would have to say. And thanks for saying that. I think it's I think talking about women in these three traditions is a good first step. And then, also sharing prayer experiences. And I know that the sisterhood at Shaarey Zedek is interested in building interfaith women's events. So I don't know, there's somebody else who's in charge of that, but I know that there's somebody who's looking for ways to do just exactly what the kind of experience that you're hoping to have and that we want to have too.
Okay, well, it's 9 o'clock, so I'm going to defer to our panelists and ask if they have any final comments.
Thank you guys so much.
Well, and I don't have any final comments other than say thank you to those who brought this together. And thank you, Margot, and thank you, Dua, for sharing. This has been a very rich experience for me.
I too would just like to thank you all for coming and, hope that you feel welcome at the Islamic Center and, it's a place that you can also feel comfortable in.
Please join me in thanking our panelists. Sister Nancy, any final remarks? Okay.